In 1972, the Bendixson family built their dream home. They built it just the way they wanted it, the way they had always dreamed of it. It was perfect. It was nestled in this comfortable little neighborhood in the St. Louis suburbs out in southern Illinois. It wasn't necessarily remarkable. Joe and Mimi Bendixson actually found the floor plan for it in a catalog and built it, but they built it exactly how they wanted it. And you would have seen a house like this, probably even in this neighborhood around here. I grew up in a house not totally unlike this. It was a 2-story bungalow with really pretty green paint, but it was a very 70s house with colors that do not exist in nature, sort of counters that were atomic orange and shag carpeting that was, there's not even a green color to compare it to in the room. So, but it was their house. It was perfect, even if it had all been produced in a Dow Corning petrochemical lab. And the Bendixsons spent 5 very happy years in that house. When they moved in, they had 2 daughters. They were in 4th and 6th grade. Those were really good years to be growing up in that house together and in that neighborhood. And after 5 years, their hearts were really broken because Joe Bendixson got a promotion which was going to move their whole family to Minneapolis. They had to move from the house. And they thought about it, and they thought, you know what, we're not going to buy a new house. We're going to rebuild the old house in Minnesota. So when they did this, I don't mean to tell you that they went for the same vibe or even stuck to the same floor plan. They rebuilt that house step by step. They went and found carpet that from 5 years ago that they put back into the house. They called appliance manufacturers and said, this oven you built 5 years ago, where do you think I could track down some last version of it that's still for sale? Mimi Bendixson went to the company that made her drapes and just through sheer force of will talked them into creating the same pattern for the drapes in Minnesota. They knew they had recreated it perfectly when their neighbors that had used to live across the street from them in Illinois came up to visit for a weekend. And on the first night, the neighbors said, you know what, this is great. We feel like we could walk out the front door right now and across the street and our house would be there. It was that perfect. And so, once again, those were good years. But the years passed, and the family grew up, and the girls grew up and moved out. By 2005, it was just Joe and Mimi in the house. Joe was getting ready to retire, and the old house was pretty big for them and for their needs, but there were just so many good times. It's hard to let go of an old house, right? And everything that you've put into it, especially the memories. So a couple of times they put it for sale and they backed out. The last time they did it, they even were bold enough to put a for sale sign out. And in Joe Bendixson's words, he said, I just pulled up the first time and saw the for sale sign, and the house just looked so sad to see it out in front of it. And so he took the sign down and fired the realtor. They sold it to their older daughter, Cheryl, who had a family of her own to raise in the new old house. There's just one problem. And the problem wasn't the atomic orange or the green carpet or anything like that. That would be a problem to me and probably most of us. But the problem was Cheryl Bendixson and her husband worked on the far east side of the Twin Cities Metroplex. The house was on the opposite side. It was a 30-mile drive through traffic. It wasn't practical to live in that house. So, and at the same time, they didn't want to leave it behind. I mean, and they knew they couldn't reconstruct it in 2005. They actually called a carpet company and said, could you make us some green shag? And they didn't get a response. And so they did the reasonable thing, what anyone would do. They cut the house into 3 pieces and loaded it onto a tractor trailer, all of the pieces onto their own tractor trailer, and drove it 30 miles to a new piece of property on the east side of the Twin Cities and put it back together. They still live in that house today, the new, old, relocated house. I love this story. It was Ira Glass interviewed this family, the journalist Ira Glass, and they talk about this move of their house. And I don't know, that may sound extreme it certainly sounds extreme to me, but But let me ask you, how many of you, if you were to close your eyes right now, you could picture the living room of the house you grew up in? I know I could. Let's do that right now. Close your eyes just for a moment. Picture that living room. For me, I think I could describe for you the fabric of the couch in my living room growing up on Lona Lane. And so picture that. Picture the kitchen that you ate in as a child. Picture your room. I bet you can remember a lot of details. Some of you are youth. It's not a difficult task. But picture the backyard. You can open your eyes now if they're still closed. As I was thinking about this series, what does it mean to call this God's house? I thought about something I read a long time ago from the Sufi mystic poet Rumi, who wrote, "All language is a longing for home. All language is a longing for home." Now, I don't think he was talking literally about the house in which we grew up, but rather that when we speak, when we think, when we read the sacred words of our faith or get together and sing together in worship, there's a longing there that has its root in sort of a feeling of displacement, that we are far from home. And so when we speak these words and when we gather together and we talk with one another, it's like we're walking a little bit further and a little bit further, or a little closer and a little closer toward home. That's what faith should be. That should be our project as a church. At our core, as St. John's, I think that should be our project. No matter what your favorite ministry is here, no matter what you're passionate about, whether you're a food ministry person or a choir person or youth or whatever it is, it should be a home-going journey. And what I mean by that is something very specific. And to talk about it, let me tell you a little story. This is a story about my growing up. And actually, you've heard a little bit about it because when I was appointed here, I wrote a biography. Dara read it in this sanctuary, in the sanctuary. And there's one line that a lot of people have asked me about, understandably. And I don't remember exactly what I wrote. But it was something along the lines of Josh's parents made him start coming to church when he was in the 8th grade because they were worried that he was getting weird. And so they brought him to church. And it turns out by luck or God's grace that the people he met in church were weirdos too. They were just his kind. And that, of course, was here at St. John's 30 years ago. But let me tell you a little bit about that story because I think it provides valuable context about what it means to be looking for home. I did start coming to church here in the 8th grade because my parents did think I was getting weird. Here's what that looked like. Now, I am sure that all of you, when you were in middle school, you were just unusually well-adjusted, comfortable, non-awkward people. See, she knows she was. That was her. You're the only one in the room. So it's weird being in middle school, right? It certainly was for me. And this is so vulnerable. My little community of friends, we were all in the poetry club together. We were the cool kids, okay? But we would write poems and sonnets and stuff, and most of the people in the club, they were all sort of getting on into those teenage years where you're a little bit dark and a little angsty, and so the poems were kind of dark, and I just wasn't feeling that quite yet. I got to that eventually, but I wasn't feeling that, and so I would write these poems about, like, sheep or the spring or joyful things, and I would just look at the looks on people's faces as I read my happy poems of my peers, and they just weren't having it. And I was like, I'm not fitting in the poetry club. And let me tell you, I have checked. There is no rung on the social ladder but below poetry club that you can fall back on if that doesn't work out for you. So I knew I had to do something to fit in. I had to go dark. Our next poetry project was supposed to be on intangible nouns, things you can't see or touch. I initially chose joy. I knew joy was going to be terrible. No one would like that. So I maybe overcorrected. And I chose death. And I don't remember what the reaction was to my poem from my peers, but what I remember distinctly is the moment my parents found the death poem. They thought that's when they decided we were getting that boy into religion right now. I think they thought I was going to go to a school and do something bad, but that's what brought me to church, and that's what brought me home, which is what church ended up being for me and the youth group at this church. But it started, do you notice where it started? It wasn't that I was feeling dark and moody and any of that, but a longing for a place to belong. And I think that's true for a lot of people. I think that's what Rumi was talking about when he says all language is a longing for home. And I tell you that to say that is our project as a church. At our core, we exist to be a home for all people. A home for those who lose their way. A home for people who have never known what home is. A home for the stranger. A home for anyone. Anyone. That's our mission. That's our sacred work. Now, there are problems with this metaphor, and in truth, I think the writer of Ephesians knows the problem as well. If you're going to use home as the metaphor, well, homes are places that families live. And the fact is, families are all about outsiders and insiders. You know if you're a member of a family or not. It's not complicated. It's very well marked who is in family and who isn't. And not only that, but, some people love the idea of family as a metaphor for church because their family growing up or their family of origin was a happy one. But that's not true of everybody. And so when we talk about family as a metaphor for church, there will always be some people who are going to say, you know what, that's fine, but count me out. The author of Ephesians, I think, knows this too, or at least the problem with the family metaphor, because he is writing to people who are struggling with sort of a similar question, just on a different level. For the early Christian movement, there was a central question that they struggled with, and it was about outsiders and insiders, and who is in the family and who is outside the family. Now, this had to do with the question of whether this was going to be an exclusively Jewish movement or a Gentile movement, or a movement that was open to Gentiles, I should say. And what we see in Ephesians is this question of, is this just for the people of God as we've known it in the Old Testament, or is it something for Greeks, or people from Africa, or even Romans? And so in Ephesians, what we hear is God saying, actually, we're not going to let anything keep anyone out of God's house, their family. God's house is for everyone. We're not just going to build some new version of the old Bendixson place for fellow Bendixsons. We're going to open up the doors, and we're going to build something new. And he's talking to Gentiles in Ephesus. They're not Jews, they're not insiders, and he is saying, you are not a stranger to God. You're family to God. Well, folks, in a world where differences are basically what we are stuck in right now and what we obsess over, in a world where I'm often at a loss as to how to even start tearing down what separates us, that is God's hope. That we can be a home and a shelter and a place of belonging for all. That's the conclusion that the early church makes. That is basically the entire point of Paul's ministry. It's something that even Jesus points to in his own ministry. And it's something we have to work for. It's something we have to name and strive for and not just talk about. It's work. It's the work of this church. To find new ways of extending the walls, new ways of being church, to lower the weapons that we've wielded in the culture wars, because that's worked out great for us over the years. It's to say that God has no enemies, only family. And yes, fair warning, this is a stewardship sermon. We're not going to talk about money this week. Come ready for battle next week as far as that goes. But it is to say that before we even talk about generosity or giving and the commitment of that, It's worth talking about, to what are we committing? Is it for good music or a strong youth program that does fun things? Is it to have a well-administered church or nice preaching? I mean, there's nothing wrong with any of those. I'm not knocking them. It's just to say, if only it were only those things. I think the hard work of church, and this is, I've heard from many of you over my first few months here, is that we want to be a church that lives into God's vision, that all people can be a part of God's family, including the people who are different, including people who are unlike us. I really do think there's a desire for us to open the doors wider and extend the community. Well, how do we get there? Well, one first step that we would have to make is to also admit that there is nervousness about that, about what extending the community would mean, because in places it would feel like loss. In the Bendixson house, it wasn't just the thought of boy, if we had nice beige carpet like our neighbors, our family would blow up. It's that to lose a piece of the physical house would be like losing a piece of the family. There's loss involved in change. Change is hard, change is loss, and who wants that? So let me just close with this observation instead, and this story about a different house. When I was in early elementary, sometime before the third grade, because we moved off of this block eventually, but when I was in early elementary, we had a family that lived down the street that we were friends with, and they had a son and a daughter that were about my age and my brother's age, and that family liked their house too, a whole lot. And they were outgrowing it. So what they did, rather than move or buy a new house, is they added to it. They built on an addition. Because they were outgrowing it. They were having a baby was on the way. But that was unnerving in its own way too. I can remember walking into my friend Keith's room. We were just going to hang out one afternoon. And there was no wall on his fourth wall anymore. There was just a big sheet of black plastic with wires and stuff hanging out. And I was only in maybe the first or second grade, but I can remember thinking, that's weird to not have a wall to your bedroom. That was unnerving, and obviously it was a loss. But then the next time I came back, and a foundation had been laid off behind it. A week after that, studs had been built and put together to build the frame of a house. And the week after that, there's wiring, and the week after that, walls, and so on and so forth. It started out as just a hole covered by some plastic, but pretty soon a new part of that home had been built. Now, they built that addition, yes, because they were having a new baby. But they also built it with a bigger idea in mind. They also extended the house to make it a place for all of their kids' friends to come and hang out. They had a big room in the middle that was like a playroom with a brand new original Nintendo system and a TV as part of it, with Super Mario Brothers and Super Mario Brothers 2. And, air hockey table and, the things that you wish you had in your own house, but you always have a friend that has fun stuff like that. They built that because they wanted to make a point of making their house a place of community. Yes, it was for a growing family, but it was also for friends. They wanted to blur the line between family and friends, and insider and outsider. They wanted this to be a place where their friends felt like family. And I think that's an okay metaphor for God's house too, where we should always be tearing walls down to build in additions so that things can be added in that extend the definition of what the Christian family can be. I think we already strive for that here at St. John's. I've seen it these last few months, and of course I'm kind of a product of it as well, but we can never rest on our laurels, and our mission in the world should always be growing and advancing so that everyone who comes here will know that this is God's house, and there's a place for you here. There's room for you. The home that you've longed for, you'll find it here. So let's pray. Gracious God, help us to knock down our walls and to extend and build, to bring new people in, to find new places around the table, to grow and to change, to see ourselves changed even as it can seem strange or scary. Tear down our walls, Lord. Amen.